Thank you very much indeed. Let me just start with Dr. Megan, if I may. Have we got time just to expand slightly on the incentives and disincentives that are highlighted in that report, and perhaps any that aren't being considered?
So if I was promised to...
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Hello? No, perfect. Thank you for that technical failure. So in terms of the incentives, if you could drive back to the slide, it would help colleagues even more. But the current incentives, when we talk about inward migration incentives and disincentives, we are looking at the key financial incentives, particularly, that are available at the moment. So the national insurance rebate that's available to people coming in after 1 year, there's, I think it's a £10,000, employee relocation incentive, and the same sort of figure for a graduate role incentive. We say in the report, and we do recognise, that these are contributors to somebody's decision to move here. It is not the only factor. We fully recognise, and indeed the recent graduate survey that was undertaken highlighted that wider factors are actually much more important in people's choice of coming, whether that's career prospects, housing, and so on. This piece of policy work fits within the wider island plan and the actions on those, so that's why we're focusing particularly on the specific incentives and disincentives here. So those are the incentives. Very briefly, on disincentives, then we are looking at particularly charges for access to healthcare most immediately. There are 3 different versions of those, very briefly. One is the immigration health surcharge that the UK applies, and that's about £1,035 per person. There are various variations on that per year. That adds up, for a family of 2 adults, 2 children, that can add up to about £18,000 for the 5 years. So that is one element that may come through as an option in the alignment of immigration policy. Importantly, looking at it as a disincentive from one angle, but also a financial contribution as the other. And there are other ways that you can charge for healthcare, which the other questions look at. And I'm conscious I could keep going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Just get a flavour. Tim Johnston, how important is it, is inward migration to achieving the Isle of Man government's economic objectives?
It's an important part, James. I think if we've had the conversations yesterday and today. I think there's a mention there of sort of 900 vacancies. I think if you add the employment agencies into that as well, you're probably up to 1,300 to 1,400 vacancies across the economy. And I think that's a challenge. Clearly, we want to make sure that we are encouraging our young people on the island to stay, to reskill, to fill those roles. But the fact is, we haven't got enough to do that. So it's important that we attract the skills we need to the island. It's always been important. I think having a healthy migration policy for any country is important. I think we should never shy away from that. That's always been the case. The growth we've seen in our economy over the last 30, 40 years has been through we've seen the population increase. We've seen people come to the island. That's really important. So whatever we do, we need to make sure that we recognise that and maintain that.
How could, Kate Lord-Brennan, how could the island benefit from a single registration system?
Well, it's interesting because actually some of the conversations that were happening this morning when people here were asked about maybe how government services should change and what their experience is of interacting with the government, also threw up this point that there are multiple steps that people here have to go through just to interact with basic public services. So the reason why I make this point is I think that the idea of a concept of a residence registration or a digital version of potentially a residence card, I think that there may be multiple reasons. Obviously, it would have to be a political decision, multiple reasons why this would be helpful. Firstly, it's about potentially ease of access to government services. It could tie back with this actually long outstanding idea of a single residence record. Here we have multiple numbers and of ways to identify ourselves to different government services. Also, I think that genuinely has been a bit of a change in the mindset from people here on the Isle of Man, whereas perhaps a few years ago we would have said, well, look, we don't want to have to identify ourselves. We just want to be able to kind of come and go and as we please and to not have to do that. I think now that there are other concerns and other interests, aside from interacting with public services, that actually, there could well be a broader acceptance of, a single resident registration. It could help government with data, but also with potentially with identification purposes, and it does tie in with some of the other work that is already ongoing to do with security. So there's lots of reasons why I think it potentially could be something that there could be political and also public appetite for in the future.
Interesting. Sandra Simpson, you've highlighted in some of your presentation changes. What changes immigration's made to address the challenges, if I can call it that way, within the immigration system. You touched upon the backlog before and said we're not out of the woods yet. How quickly do you think you can turn around to the levels where you'd like to be?
Well, we're getting there. The problem is in terms of actually having the numbers of staff to actually process those applications in the time frame that we would want to do it. It takes time for them to get the qualifications and to get the experience that they need to actually do that. I think by the end of this year, we should be in the right position. We've definitely moved forward huge leaps and bounds in the last couple of months to a point where we are now processing them. And the turnaround time is improving. We haven't actually issued that turnaround time because we just need to have the confidence that we're going to maintain it. And until then, I don't think we should publish it. So it's still showing at near enough 90 days, but we are actually processing them within about 45 days.
Thank you. And just before we open up to the floor, Jane Poole Wilson, it's an obvious question in a way. How important is cross-working across government to secure our island's safety? But how quickly is it happening is probably a better way of putting it.
Yes, Jane, I mean, it's vital. I think when I was talking before, I was talking about our different law enforcement agencies and the importance of their collaboration. So it does happen. It has happened, but I think what we have done is we've seen activity around security happen in dedicated operations, and what we understand, and it has been quite a rapid change from the understanding of the changing nature of the threat, that surge operations to deal with particular threats leads you to saying, well, actually, we need a more sustained, comprehensive approach to this. And so that is really building on that joint agency approach and collaborating as we need to with other departments across government. But it is absolutely fundamental.
I made a note earlier in your presentation. You said the risks of the criminals of being caught are high, but the rewards are higher still. So how do you begin as a department to address that balance?
Well, I think, the difficulty is, and I suppose, I was born and brought up here, and we've always moved quite freely, and we've taken it for granted that, where people used to come here on holiday and say it's like going back in time, and, nothing would happen. Other things happen in other places. Those sorts of threats and problems won't come to the Isle of Man. I think we are fooling ourselves if we don't think that the sorts of problems and risks that we see in other places couldn't come here. And what we have certainly seen, and it's been actually quite rapid since post-COVID, what we have seen is actually if we continue to think that our sort of porous ports of entry and our relative freedoms, which, I'm sure we've all valued and enjoyed, won't be exploited by those who seek to bring harm, then we're making a grave mistake. So I think, as I said, a big part of this is deterrence. The harder we work to make it difficult for people, the criminality, their business models, the idea that they would that they might look somewhere else. And I'm not, I don't think any of us are naive enough to think that there won't still be a risk. Of course there will be a risk. What we are doing is working hard to bring down that risk as much as possible, to make it harder for people to use the Isle of Man, because we recognise the damage and the harm that goes with that.
Thank you. Okay, let's open this up. Katrina and Lily are on the mics. We've got gentlemen here at the front, Ewan in the white T-shirt. Just while you make your way to him, Lily, just let me ask you, Sandra, a question for immigration. Are there any stats available on the number of residents leaving the island?
No, is the answer to that.
Okay, and I suppose the obvious follow-up is do you know why?
Because we don't record people leaving the island. Right. So there are no stats in that in terms of people that have immigrated into the island and leave. In fact, we don't actually record when people come here. We know how many visas we have issued, but there is no record of whether they have actually arrived in the Isle of Man. We can do processes to check whether that has actually happened or not, and we are looking at the historic cases to see what that is. But they don't have to check in with immigration when they get here.
Do you think we should, Minister, potentially, or Sandra?
Personally, I think we should. There should be, not just for stats. I think we should do that to be mindful of the care of those people that are coming into the Isle of Man, to give them a base of somebody that they can come and talk to, and to provide information that they need to live and work here.
Okay, we might come back to that if time allows. Ewan, gentleman in the middle.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know where to start with this one, to be honest. It's quite interesting you're talking about tightening up the borders, and at the moment we've got a situation where government has let a company come in and got through the Financial Supervision Commission, the Gamble Commission, doing exactly what you're talking about. But going on from that, I've dealt with the youth of the island for many years here, and if you think that the drugs problem is new, it's not. It's been going on for a long time. I mean, I think the government has hidden its head many years ago on that problem. Yes, it is a business. And yes, these people will find another way of getting in here. Is there support for our kids that are involved in this? No, there isn't. The situation with government at the moment, if you talk to the people on the street, is dire. Your confidence level is so low. The people who live here are concerned about their future. They're concerned about the people that are coming here, the quality of the people that are coming here. Now, there is good people coming here, absolutely, totally, but there is a lot of people walking around this island who are not going to put into this island. So you have got issues here, absolutely. Jane, you were talking about facial recognition. You mentioned the other week on the radio about ANPR. You failed to mention about facial recognition. I would suggest to you that's probably because people will not stomach that. You're following agendas from the UK. If you look what's happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks in the UK, facial recognition vans and cameras have been popping up in cities over there. You're just following a bigger agenda. I would suggest that there's problem, reaction, solution in a lot of things that's happening here, because the government has caused a lot of the problems.
Well, would anyone like to respond to the initial points Ewan has made? And then he's probably got a question to follow as well. But Jane Purr-Wilson?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I don't think the drugs problem, as you say, is a new problem. I think what we have seen is the increase in the serious and organised criminal activity level, and we've also seen, in terms of exploitation of young and vulnerable people on the Isle of Man, we've seen more violence accompanying that now. And I think that's why, the idea that we need to step up efforts to try and tackle this is right. But I think you're right, it's not just, we're talking about security today. Alongside that, I think, is protection for those who are at risk of exploitation. And that's why, I touched on in my opening remarks the daily exploitation meeting, which is designed to try and identify, particularly it's our younger people who are at risk of exploitation, so that we can try and support them, try and deter them and divert them. I mean, other things that are not part of the agenda today, but I am acutely aware also are part of active work streams, are around youth justice. We don't really want to see our young people ending up in the criminal justice system if we can find another way to try and divert them from that type of, it's another type of harm. And I think, you know, again, it's not part of the agenda today, but there's a wider debate that is due to come back to Tynwald on overarching drugs policy for the Isle of Man, which I think, you know, we do have to understand the levels of harms that can happen when you're talking about illegal drugs. And it's related to healthcare, it's related to prevention and treatment, it's related to education, as well as the impacts in the criminal justice system. So it's a multi-layered, complex problem. We absolutely must not shy away from it. But I think, you know, the truth is there are illegal drugs, and I referenced heroin, cocaine, as well as cannabis as the drugs that we see most commonly coming into the island. The people behind these activities are absolutely ruthless, and so I think the security element of this is vitally important.
Kate Lord Brennan, just before June asks the question, have you got anything to add on that?
Thank you, June. Just to really reinforce that, you know, it's because of some of the concerns that you clearly, you know, share, that there is such a focus on this that's not just been explained in quite a full way today, but that has been, you know, in the focus for a good period of time now. We are having to look at things differently to focus on some of the things that you've raised. It's not, you know, it's not the right thing to do just to not address these things or not discuss them. I think it's probably the first time that there has been such full thought over these things, and, you know, maybe it's the case that these things should have been thought about a long, long time ago. But I don't think that there is there's a shift now. There are many reasons why we need to seriously address processes, different types of enforcement legislation, but also to think about how we can do things in the future. So I hope that you can see, even from the focus today, that is being considered in a very serious way.
And is there a question you want to put to a particular member of the panel, June?
Yeah, back to Jane, really. I'm just trying to pick the bones out of things that you guys say sometimes and the hidden bits in between. You mentioned cash in paying for tickets on the steam packet. Are you suggesting then that there will not be cash payments in the future? Is that what you were aligning to with that comment?
So, yes, I think on that, the point is, it is very easy at the moment to travel under a false name. And obviously, if you pay cash, you know, if you used a card, that's perhaps one of the ways that you would be able to verify who you are. But you can travel under a false name. And in fact, the concern is, we've talked a lot about drugs and serious and organised crime. Last week, I was at a domestic abuse conference on the Isle of Man. And some of you may be familiar with Diana Parks and the tragic story of her daughter, Jo Simpson, who was killed by her partner. As she pointed out, at the moment, when he is eventually released from prison, he's likely to be under licence. It's highly likely to be the case that the Isle of Man will be an exclusion area. But the truth is, if there's no way of verifying the identity of people travelling to the Isle of Man, how can our law enforcement agencies take their part in enforcing that type of restriction? So my point is, not so much that cash is a problem, but the pre-verification of travellers' identity on so many levels in terms of maintaining security for the island.
Thank you, June. I am going to have to, because I know I've got 4 hands behind you, but thank you for your questions. Yes, lady there.
So 12 months ago, I stood and asked the Chief Minister a question about a case of modern slavery on the Isle of Man. And I think I'd like to commend the government, which is pretty rare, for the action that they have taken, and that this is now forefront of their discussions, the issues across immigration and security. I think, though, it's disappointing that in those 12 months it's taken this period to have this open discussion about the very dark underbelly that's going on our island, and that throughout that period that there hasn't been an open discussion so that members of the public and employers can take steps to make themselves aware of what's been happening and steps that they can take to present it. It shouldn't take 12 months for a modern slavery poster to be put on the back of a toilet door on the steam packet so people know how to reach out. I'd say in relation to Jane's point in relation to multi-agency working, that isn't my experience of the people who approach me who've suffered wage deductions, threats for deportation, threats for violence against them. And they often find themselves shunted between immigration, work permit, MERS, victim support, the police, each one passing on responsibility or absolving themselves of responsibility, and they seem to go in a merry-go-round. And my other question is to the ministers on the panel. Sandra said, it's not easy when you're on a minimum wage trying to support your family. As presently structured, the minimum wages on the Immigration Act haven't been raised since 2018. That means we have people, perhaps with a wife and any number of children, doing a 40-hour week for the grand salary of £23,600, and it is not possible to live on that level of salary, not with the housing costs and the other expenses. And government haven't taken any steps to urgently look at that and see how it makes people vulnerable. Because in my experience, if you need to feed your children and you need to put a roof over your head, you're forced to work in the black market economy, where you're even more vulnerable to these abuses, and to where, you know, your route into criminality isn't an option, but it becomes a necessity. And so I'd like to ask what steps you're going to be taking in the immediate term to raise awareness of the labour exploitation, modern slavery issues which have been going on, and what, in terms of an economic policy level, we often see this 5,000 new jobs advertised, but can that be 5,000 new cleaning jobs at 20,800? What exactly is it that the new jobs look like, and what levels of salary should they attract so that people can live decent lives contributing to our economy?
Thank you, Marie. Excellent questions. The latter point, do you want to start, Minister?
Yes, and I think, thanks, Maria. And I think, you know, yeah, absolutely, we talk about the need for those new jobs across our economy, and that's the point. It is across the economy. I think we recognise we need a full range of skills at a full range of salary levels. This is not one area. I think you're absolutely right. We recognise the fact that it's expensive to live on the island. It's more expensive than the UK, obviously, with challenges. That is why the government has set out a commitment to remove the minimum wage and get towards a living wage. And as the Island Plan sets out, the plan is to amalgamate that in next year to do that, recognising that, you know, people need fair minimum salary levels to be able to live. So that's certainly something that this government is working towards.
And that former question, I don't know if either of the other ministers wants to take that one.
But just to be really clear, what we are looking at, and part of what's been summarised today, is about protections and is about controls. And you're quite right, Maria. You know that we are reviewing closely the immigration pathways, and you know we've needed to, and quite correctly, got some expertise on that because it is so complex. But it was already referenced that looking at addressing the sort of earning thresholds is something that is under consideration. But you know, in doing this, we need to do it carefully. There are, you know, a range of different jobs that people come to the island to work through absolutely legitimate means. Now, it goes back slightly to a point that Minister Paul Wilson was talking about earlier, which is there is obviously a difference between criminality, which obviously there must be vigilance and enforcement and awareness about at many different levels across the board, you know, whether that's a sort of a policing level, whether it's checking at an administrative level, or whether it's through different forms of regulation. But then there is also the point about people coming here through perfectly legitimate means. So we need to strike the right balance. In a nutshell, to the points being raised, that's exactly why we are looking at all of this in such a comprehensive way. It's not the sort of thing that can be announced within a few weeks. A lot of this work has been going on already, and some of the changes that we've brought forward, for example, to do with the move that was decided in Cabinet Office to move passports and immigration to be part of customs and excise, was particularly around this point of enforcement, information, and closer working. So that was already done probably about a year ago. There's much more we can do, but we're looking at it carefully in terms of incentives and disincentives, as well as some of the broader enforcement and policing and serious issues.
Thank you, Marie. I think the lady just behind you there, actually, with her hand up, if she goes next, and then we'll come to this gentleman at the front. Thank you.
Hi. One of the things that you mentioned was the potential risk to the island about backdoor visas. It's not a potential risk, it's actually happening. There are agencies advertising out of Dubai constantly. I've tracked in the past 3 weeks 700 enquiries of applications to agencies in Dubai for obtaining visas through the Isle of Man backdoor and then the free travel into the UK. So that is something that's been happening for quite some time. The other point I've got to make is I left the island 10 years ago, moved back 2 years ago, really because of the state the UK is in, how horrific it is, and the crime that's there. To come back to see stabbings, rapes, date rape drugs being administered weekly on the island, and the lack of control on the borders is pretty devastating. And one of the points to put across, I've seen up to 18 police, border control staff operating at the steam packet. Obviously, there's no border control the UK Haitian side. But what might really be useful to help stop drugs in the island is that they work weekends, because they only seem to operate Monday to Friday, and there is no border control at weekends. So,
thank you for that. Can I just interject? As far as I'm aware, there are weekend people on duty, but please tell us if otherwise.
No. Yeah, so, sorry, just on that latter point, I referenced the integration of ports policing into the Isle of Man Constabulary, because I think, as ever on the island, one of our challenges is the extent of the issues we're trying to address with the staffing profile that we have, and by making operational changes of the type we're making, in part that is to deploy more staff more often, and I referenced that, you know, rather than doing the work that we want to do in a way that people might perceive as not sort of 24/7 or not sustainable and comprehensive. That's why, the activity we're talking about, particularly operational change and focusing more collaboration, is absolutely to allow this to be on a sustained basis.
Are they on duty at weekends?
Absolutely, yeah. So previously, customs and certainly immigration didn't work on a shift pattern, and you are quite right. We didn't work weekends, but we do now. So that was introduced about 5 months ago, and we have started working on the weekends. The shift rota pattern will take time to assess whether it works, when it doesn't work, and we will be looking at it by the end of the year. But at the moment, we have started that work.
And any comments from any of the panel on the lady's very informative points about the visa situation?
Yeah, any information you can provide us on that would be very interesting to us, and you can provide that either to the constabulary or to ourselves.
Can I ask you, what are the demographics? Do you know what the demographics are of those who apply for visas?
The demographics are widespread.
Right.
They're not necessarily from one country or another country.
Okay, thank you, Kate Lord-Brennan.
Well, one of the things that we can start to do is to look at where visa applications are coming from. So that was already announced yesterday morning. The other point, and I know it is of public concern, right? So when you see local news coverage that talks about some far-flung company in another place far away from the Isle of Man, almost promoting the Isle of Man, about moving here and visas and things like that. And I remember, we've certainly had conversations about that, and these things do get picked up on and looked into. We can't control how other people in other places might market or promote the Isle of Man. in the way that you've probably seen and we've seen covered. The things that we can control are how the applications are processed and what checks there are, and that is why we've seen greater resource go into all of these things, and it will be helped too by the sort of digitisation processes that are brought in. So we are aware of that, but it's not something that is coming at our initiative. That's absolutely not correct. We want to make sure that we can stick by the correct immigration routes handling on the one hand, and also have the vigilance over other things that happen by virtue of the fact that we are in the common travel area, which means that people who are within that area can also freely come and go from the Isle of Man. So there's two different elements of that, but we do look into these things where we can, but the response and handling, that's on our side too.
Just on to slightly paraphrase a question from one of the attendees, the detail on types of the visas that are issued, it wasn't in the latest Isle of Man numbers report. So is it available somewhere, or will it be made available?
I think that's probably something that we could do. We do get questions of this nature sometimes that come up through parliamentary questions, for example, or indeed if there's internal queries that we want to find out ourselves. So we can get those numbers. I guess one of the advantages is that we can get that information this side. Another point to make is that there is also a significant UK aspect to handling and processing when it comes to immigrations and visas. So that's a good thing, in that there has to be checks on that side too. Effectively, we get to double up on some of that on our side. So we can keep elements of it within our control, but other elements are also reliant on the UK visa immigration processing side of things.
With the panel's agreement, according to that, we've got 20 seconds. And I know some Tums are probably a rumbling lunch is going to be served. It's 10 to 1. But if we can just stretch it till 1 o'clock, because I've got over 40 questions here, we're only going to touch on a fraction of those. There was a gentleman here, and then we'll come to you, sir.
My question is regarding the wet stamp. I mean, I'm sure you'd agree with me that international travel is, as it is, very, very stressful. You did give us a timeline about 2027 that it's going to be e-visas and digital. Well, life goes on till then. I've got a business visa, which is the proper vignette, which is in conjunction with the rest of the world's norms of safety, security, and being able to go through their computer scanners. But unlike my wife and daughters, which are the wet stamp, every single airport, point of departure, point of transit, and point of entry in UK, if I may say so, we are detained and kept behind. It's very stressful, and travel is an integral part of our business here, and it does become an impediment to the business as well. Is there anything in the interim that can be done so that it makes it easier? And the other thing is, we understand that we were told that it may not be true or may be debatable that the IOM Home Office and the UK Home Office don't communicate, is why sometimes even on my vignette, I'm stopped and asked, where it's been issued, we don't have a record of this and things like that, even though it is issued by their office.
Yeah, we are looking at that in the interim, and I am aware of your question previously, and I have some of the staff looking at that to be able to respond to that to you. It's not easy, and we do appreciate that in the interim we are going to have to do something about that. And we do talk to the Home Office. We talk to them a lot more than we used to. And we're discussing how quickly we can change things. But the use of these paper documents is becoming an issue, definitely, that needs to be addressed.
Can I just ask you, thank you very much, are people without residence visas being deported? Is the question that's come in here?
So the Immigration Office can curtail a visa. It's like a cancellation. So we can curtail a visa. Once we do that, they no longer have permission to be in the country. Deporting them is more of a constabulary thing to do. So once they're no longer able to stay here, it's not necessarily the immigration.
It's enforced by the next agency.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's enforced by the next agency.
Okay.
And I think on that, it would depend on what has led to an enforcement action by the constabulary. So yes, it is possible to deport. We've seen other situations though where the intervention by the constabulary has been around another offence, and so that gets prosecuted. And the other thing that we do, and people may be aware of, is once a prosecution is successful, people are sometimes excluded from the island for a period. So it would always depend on the specific circumstances.
Well, where does the judiciary fit into the strategy for security, if I can put it that way?
So I think, the judiciary, obviously separate from us as the government, and their role is when prosecutions are brought forward, whether it's whatever the offence, they will then sit and make the decision on is the conviction to be upheld and what's the sentence. People will be aware that because we craft our own laws and we also have the capacity to set tariffs for different offences at a level that suits the Isle of Man, the judiciary will operate within the Isle of Man's legislative framework, and therefore the sentencing, if you like, and the sentences given out will be in line with that. But I think it's a really important point. I do get people sometimes contacting me and asking me to look at individual sentences, and I think the issue is that whilst Tynwald frames our laws, then we hand over to the judiciary and recognise their independence to hear particular cases, listen to the evidence and determine the appropriate sentence in that case.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman with his hand up there, and then Lily, will go to that gentleman behind you there, if we may. Thank you.
Yes, I have 3 quick questions.
Do you know, sir, with full respect, I'm going to ask you if you can pick your best one. Just due to time, nothing more than that.
My best one is, will making cannabis legal on the Isle of Man make this place safer? Because it's certainly a disincentive for my family. I don't want my 3-year-old growing up in a country, a jurisdiction where cannabis is legal. But will you answer as a panel, do you think it will make this place safer?
I don't know if it's suitable for all the panel, but I'll start with the Minister, if I may.
I think it's one of those questions it's almost impossible to give a yes-no answer to, because cannabis is obviously one illicit substance.
No, I'm talking about that one. My wife is a psychiatrist who deals with CAMs, young people who are suffering because of cannabis. So that one, just concentrate on that one, cannabis. Will it make it safer to be legalised on this island?
So I think I don't want to preempt my colleagues having a debate on our wider drugs policy. We did have a piece of work done by Liverpool John Moores University last year to look at overall the harms involved in illicit substances. And one aspect of the harms of illicit substances is, as you say, what are the health harms? And so I think in any decision about future policy, you're taking account of what are the health harms of a particular drug such as cannabis, but also what are the criminal harms. One of the feedback elements we got from the public, and there was some surveys and workshops done, is there is a considerable level of public concern about the exploitation and criminalisation of young people, and therefore that is a safety and a harm risk. But I absolutely take your point that there is a harm risk with any drug, but we could equally talk about the harm risks that go with alcohol, which we do legalise and regulate. The other complexity is the Isle of Man's position to make decisions about changes in drugs law unilaterally, because we are signatories to UN conventions via the UK. So it's a complex picture. I'm not sure there's a simple answer, actually, to your question, whether it would make the island safer, but I do think it merits full exploration and debate.
Do you know, I'm going to cut it short there, but I think there's time this afternoon, hopefully, to engage in conversation and show some respect as well to the Minister while she's listening, and just trying to, there's a bigger debate there, and we just haven't got time now, but do stay around, sir, because I'm sure that the Minister would talk to you. Yes, the gentleman there. Mark, I think.
Jane, I'd just like to support your the government's stance on tightening up security in the ports. I'm in the shipping and maritime industry. I know the issues globally on the corruption in ports. It is horrific. But just to put it into balance, because everything has to be a balance. There has to be a balance. how are you, and you're attacking criminality, but what about individuals? So, you know, we've all got idiotic teenagers, and we were all idiot teenagers at some point, right? And, you know, festivals in the UK, I'm just using this as an example, festivals in the UK are very popular. Let's say, for example, a teenager goes away, they go to a festival, they've got a tablet on them, and yes, it's illegal, but it's commonplace, let's be honest. We're all grown-ups here. And they come back to the Isle of Man in the port, and there's a tablet. How will the police treat that? And it's just trying to get the proportionality right, just being open and honest about it, because there's no black and white answer to this, Jane. Just want to get your view on that, if I could.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think it goes back to what I've referenced already, which is wider drugs policy, because one of the harms that we see is the criminalisation of particularly young people when they are caught carrying something that's illicit. And so I think in that wider sense, having a conversation about education and awareness amongst our younger people, but also looking at, you know, what is the proportionate response to the individual who may get caught, who is a user, you know, what do we do to not criminalise them, but perhaps to divert them or find another way to deal with that. For those who are addicted to particular substances, what are we doing around prevention and health intervention? But I agree with you, Mark, it has to be proportionate, and it has to understand the different level of threat, and a youngster who makes a silly mistake is a million miles away from a serious and organised criminal.
But I think sorry.
No, it's all right. Just we are out of time, but I want to try and squeeze two more in if I can, Mark, but hopefully carry on that conversation in the lunch break. Thank you. Just linking Andy Ralph's presentation with Sandra's before, immigration, visa, work permit application, ripe obviously for digitalisation to ensure quality and quantity of applications can be raised. Any specific plans for this to be fast-tracked, Sandra? Sorry, the visa, the work permit application, digitalisation. Any chance to ensure that it can be fast-tracked, the whole process?
The work permit side of it, that's actually dealt with by DFE rather than...
So that is a Tim Johnston question, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, well, I think
it's connected.
It is, but I think that the point about work permits, of course, is, you know, that we had a public consultation about this last year. The facts are that 99% of work permits are passed within 48 hours, and that's one of the issues we have. I mean, work permits, I mean, the history is very much, of course, there's a time when we had higher unemployment, and we were concerned about that. Work permits were a very important part of making sure that, you know, we did help and support local employment. We're in a very different environment now, as we're talking about. So the question then is, you know, are work permits as they are still relevant? Clearly, there has been a consultation on that. There's public support to make a change. That's in process, because I think it's important that when we're looking at work permits and we're talking about some of these other issues, one of the issues we're talking about is data and information. And actually, before we make any changes, we need to make sure we've got something else in its place, which is very much about registration, and that's not just about work permits, that's also for people coming through the immigration process, because obviously, just to confirm, remember that work permits are only relevant to people coming in from the common travel area, not for immigration. So having something that's broadly across the whole piece that does that registration and information gathering needs to be put in place, and that's an important part of this whole security issue. So that's why the work permit discussion has sort of been put on hold to a certain extent, but it's part of this broader question.
We have reached the bewitching hour and some. I really am aware of that. Let's go for lunch and talk. I think that's the key out of this. There's a lot to discuss, and I'm sure most, if not all of you, are staying around for the foreseeable future. It is just after 1 o'clock. We'll be back at 10 to 2 with Deborah Heather, but just before we go to the Snaefell Suite for lunch, let's show our thanks to our panellists this lunchtime.